What happens when a company builds the perfect engine for a world that no longer exists? GM spent close to $1 billion building one of the finest engines ever put in an American car. They built it specifically to beat Lexus. They built it to prove Cadillac still belonged at the top. Then, quietly, they discontinued the car it was built for. Not because the engine failed, not because the engineering was wrong. The world had already moved on before the first buyer ever turned the key. That is the Eldorado's story. But to understand how it ended, you have to understand why the name ever mattered in the first place. The word Eldorado comes from Spanish. It means the golden one. Spanish explorers used it to describe a mythical city of immense wealth somewhere in the Americas, a place so rich it seemed impossible, something people chased and never quite found. Cadillac chose that name in 1953, and the choice was deliberate. The Eldorado wasn't just a car, it was a statement about what American luxury was capable of being. In those early years, the Eldorado occupied a category almost entirely its own. The 1953 original was a hand-finished convertible, built in very limited numbers, priced at roughly twice what a standard Cadillac cost. It was the kind of car that existed to show what the brand could do when money was no object. Celebrities ordered them. The Eisenhower inaugural parade featured them. The name carried weight from the beginning. Through the late 1950s and into the 60s, the Eldorado evolved into something more defined. The personal luxury coupe became its natural form, a two-door car built not for practicality, but for presence. Long hood, short deck, an interior that felt more like a private room than a driver's cabin. The idea behind it was simple. Some buyers did not want a sedan. They wanted something that said something about them the moment it appeared in a driveway. That idea resonated deeply in post-war America. The country was prosperous, confident, and spending. The personal luxury coupe was not a niche product. It was an aspirational one. Buyers who could not yet afford an Eldorado wanted one. Buyers who could afford one bought it as proof of arrival. The nameplate carried genuine cultural meaning through 2 decades of production. Then came 1976, and a moment that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Cadillac built a final run of Eldorado convertibles that year and announced them as the last American convertibles, full stop. Not just the last Cadillac convertibles, the last ones, period, from any major American manufacturer. Buyers responded by purchasing them as instant collectibles. Some sat undriven in garages from the day they were delivered. The gesture was grand, but it was also an early signal of something changing beneath the surface. The convertible was not discontinued because nobody wanted open-air driving. It was discontinued because the regulatory environment, fuel economy pressures, and shifting buyer priorities were already beginning to reshape what American luxury meant. The Eldorado adapted by becoming a coupe only. The roof stayed on, the name stayed, but something in the car's original spirit had quietly departed. The 11th and final generation arrived for the 1992 model year. It was a 2-door coupe riding on a longitudinal front-wheel drive platform, assembled at Hamtramck alongside the Buick Riviera and Oldsmobile Aurora. Shared lines, shared costs, shared infrastructure. The economics of personal luxury had changed enough that even Cadillac's flagship coupe needed to share a plant with its cousins to justify the production run. The new body was clean and modern, the proportions were right, and waiting in the wings was an engine that General Motors had spent years and enormous resources developing. It was an engine designed to prove that Cadillac still belonged at the top of the American luxury conversation. The name still meant something in 1992. The question was whether the world it had been built for still existed. The answer was already forming, and it was not the one General Motors had hoped for. But by the dawn of the 90s, that golden name was no longer enough to protect Cadillac from a reality they had not seen coming. To understand what General Motors was attempting with this car, you have to understand the position the company was in when development began. General Motors entered the 1990s in genuine trouble. Market share had fallen from roughly 46% in 1980 to roughly 35% by 1990. A decade of competitive pressure from Japanese manufacturers had exposed structural weaknesses that American volume alone had previously masked. The early 90s recession made everything worse. Plant closures, workforce reductions. A company that had once seemed untouchable was now visibly contracting. And then, in 1989, Lexus arrived. The LS400 launched at a price point that undercut the Cadillac DeVille, while exceeding it in almost every quality measure that mattered to luxury buyers. Refinement, reliability, fit, and finish. The gap was not subtle, and the automotive press was not quiet about it. For Cadillac, the message was clear. The old assumptions no longer held. If the division was going to survive as a genuine luxury brand rather than a domestic default, it needed a powertrain that could stand alongside the best Japan was building. What followed was one of the most ambitious engineering programs in GM's post-war history. The Northstar 5.8 was developed specifically to answer that challenge. It was a 4.6-liter dual overhead cam V8, all aluminum, with 32 valves. It represented a genuine departure from the pushrod engines that had powered American luxury cars for decades. At the time, GM Communications described the total development cost of the Northstar system, engine and transaxle combined, at close to $1 billion. That figure has never been independently confirmed from GM's financial filings, but the engineering scope involved makes it entirely plausible. This was not an evolution of an existing design. It was a ground-up program aimed at a specific competitor. Two variants were developed. The LD8 produced 270 horsepower for the standard Eldorado. The L37 produced 300 horsepower for the Eldorado Touring Coupe. Both were introduced for the 1993 model year. There is a detail worth pausing on here. The 1992 Eldorado, the first year of the new generation, did not have the Northstar at all. The new body arrived wearing the old 4.9-liter pushrod V8 from the previous generation, producing 200 horsepower because the Northstar simply was not ready for production yet. GM shipped the new car with the old engine for an entire model year. A buyer who purchased a 1992 Eldorado thinking they were getting the next generation of Cadillac power was, in mechanical terms, still driving the previous one. The Northstar did not exist in that body until 1993. When it did arrive, it came with a decision that reveals exactly how seriously GM's engineers were taking the competitive threat. The Lexus LS400 used a timing belt, which meant scheduled replacement intervals and the catastrophic failure risk that comes with a belt-driven system. The Northstar used twin timing chains, one per bank, designed to last the life of the engine without scheduled replacement. That choice added manufacturing complexity and cost. It was made deliberately, as a direct counter to a maintenance requirement that the benchmark car carried. The engineers were not just building an engine, they were building an argument. The argument was compelling. The Northstar was genuinely competitive in refinement, power delivery, and engineering ambition. Road tests confirmed it. The problem was not the powertrain. The problem was timing, in a different sense entirely. By the time the Northstar reached maturity and the Eldorado had found its footing as a complete package, the segment it was built for was already beginning to hollow out. The buyers GM had designed this car to impress were starting to look elsewhere, not at European competitors, not at Lincoln. Somewhere GM itself was quietly pointing them. The Northstar was a remarkable engine sitting inside a car that carried a fundamental structural compromise. The 11th generation Eldorado used a longitudinal front-wheel drive layout, meaning the engine sat parallel to the car's long axis and drove the front wheels through a transaxle positioned ahead of the front axle. This arrangement was chosen specifically to accommodate the Northstar's size, without the packaging penalties that come from mounting a large displacement V8 sideways. It was a reasonable engineering solution to a real problem. Physics doesn't negotiate. With both the engine and the transaxle sitting ahead of the front wheels, the weight distribution tilted forward. The front overhang grew longer than a comparable rear-wheel drive platform would require. And under hard cornering, when lateral forces loaded the front tires simultaneously with the demands of steering and power delivery, the limits of the layout became apparent. Period road tests noted it consistently. The Eldorado handled competently. It did not handle like a European luxury coupe of comparable price. GM's engineers knew this. The Eldorado Touring Coupe exists largely because they knew it. The ETC was developed with explicit reference to the BMW 8 Series and the Mercedes-Benz SL as handling benchmarks. The engineers who worked on it had access to those cars and used them. The Touring Coupe received a faster steering ratio than the base Eldorado, revised spring rates at both ends, and larger stabilizer bars, front and rear. The intent was to close the gap between what a front-wheel drive longitudinal platform could do and what buyers spending comparable money on a European coupe were experiencing. Road tests from Car and Driver and Motor Trend confirmed the ETC was measurably better than the base car. They also confirmed the European benchmarks weren't fully matched. The gap narrowed. It didn't close. On a front-wheel drive platform carrying that weight distribution, there was a ceiling and the engineers reached it. The suspension technology itself was genuinely sophisticated. Road sensing suspension used accelerometers at each wheel to read road surface inputs and adjust damper rates within milliseconds, faster than any driver could perceive an individual road event. The accelerometers were the same type developed for airbag deployment sensors, repurposed here for continuous suspension management. It was a cost efficiency measure that produced real adaptive capability. The system worked. It just worked within the constraints of a platform that had already made certain trade-offs permanent. Inside the car, a different kind of gap showed up in a different way. The Northstar's refinement set an expectation the moment the engine started. Smooth, quiet, effortless power delivery from an all-aluminum 32-valve V8 that genuinely competed with the best Japan was building. Then, buyers looked down at the interior materials, and the expectation met reality. Period road tests praised the powertrain consistently and noted the cabin with equal consistency. At a price point above $37,000, the materials did not match what the engine promised. The leather, the plastics, the fit of the panels, they reflected the financial constraints General Motors was operating under. Constraints that the powertrain program had somehow escaped, but the interior had not. There was also the pass key theft deterrent, which embedded a resistor pellet inside the ignition key. The system read the pellet's resistance value each time the key was inserted, and if the value did not match what the computer expected, it disabled the starter and fuel injection for a 3-minute penalty period. As a theft deterrent, it worked. As a long-term ownership proposition, it carried a slow fuse. Key wear and pellet corrosion over time could cause the system to reject a legitimate key, leaving the owner stranded by the same technology designed to protect them. Dealer service was required to resolve it, which created a circular problem when the car could not be driven to the dealer. These were not fatal flaws individually. The Northstar's refinement was real. The electronic throttle control dynamics were genuinely improved. The road sensing suspension delivered measurable capability, but the sum of the compromises told a story about a car built under constraint, and luxury buyers in the 90s were developing sharper instincts for that story. The tragedy of the Eldorado was not that the engineers stopped trying to close these gaps. It was that, while they were perfecting the suspension and refining the powertrain, the buyers had already started looking at a completely different kind of vehicle. What was happening outside the showroom would prove far more consequential than anything happening inside it. The personal luxury coupe had always been built on a specific idea. Some buyers wanted a car that expressed something beyond transportation. The two-door format, the long hood, the carefully appointed interior, these things communicated a version of success that mattered to the people buying them. Through the 70s and into the 80s, that idea held. The segment was not enormous, but it was stable and it was profitable. Buyers who had spent their careers working toward a certain kind of life wanted a certain kind of car to reflect it. Then the 90s arrived and the idea started to dissolve. Sport utility vehicles had existed for decades as working tools, body-on-frame trucks with four-wheel drive built for people who needed them. What happened in the early 90s was different. Manufacturers discovered that the same basic architecture, softened and enlarged and fitted with leather seats, could satisfy something the station wagon and the sedan never quite had. It offered height, it offered presence, it offered the feeling of capability even when that capability was never used. And it offered interior space that a two-door coupe, by definition, could never match. The aspirational purchase motivation that had driven personal luxury coupe sales for decades did not disappear. It migrated. Buyers who, in 1985, might have walked into a Cadillac showroom and ordered an Eldorado were walking into the same showroom a decade later and ordering something taller, something with a higher seating position, something that communicated a different version of arrival. GM understood this. The evidence is in what GM built. The Cadillac Escalade arrived in 1999, positioned directly at the buyer demographic the Eldorado had always served. Same brand, same showroom, higher transaction prices. The Escalade was not a response to what competitors were doing. It was a response to where GM's own customer data was pointing. The brand was, in the most literal sense, cannibalizing its own flagship. Every Escalade sold to a buyer who might once have considered an Eldorado was a data point confirming that the coupe's dummies were numbered. Meanwhile, the Eldorado's reputation was absorbing damage from a direction that had nothing to do with its actual engineering. Dex Cool, GM's orange organic acid coolant, was specified for the Northstar from 1996 onward. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, Dex Cool became the subject of a class action lawsuit involving millions of GM vehicles. The lawsuit centered on intake manifold gasket failures in GM's 3.1-liter and 3.4-liter V6 engines, not the Northstar. The chemistry involved was different. The failure mode was different. But Eldorado owners heard about Dex Cool and responded. Some changed their coolant on guidance that did not fully apply to the Northstar's all-aluminum cooling system. Some made service decisions based on a controversy that was only partially relevant to the car they owned. The Northstar's actual cooling system vulnerability was real but specific. The head bolt threads, cut directly into the aluminum block, could strip under the thermal stress of an overheating event. When that happened, head gasket failure followed, and the repair was significant. NHTSA complaint data for the Eldorado concentrated heavily in cooling system failures, confirming the failure mode was reaching regulatory attention at meaningful volumes. Proper coolant maintenance and avoiding overheating prevented it in most cases, but the reputation attached to the engine persisted regardless of the cause, and reputations in the luxury segment are slow to recover. In 2000 and in 2001, Cadillac invested in a visual refresh, revised front fascia, new headlight design, updated taillights. The exterior looked sharper, more current. Period reviews acknowledged the improvement and noted what had not changed underneath. The platform was the same, the powertrain was the same, the fundamental architecture was the same one that had launched in 1992. Cosmetic investment without platform investment is the clearest possible signal of where a manufacturer's capital priorities have moved, and anyone paying attention could read it. By the time those refreshed cars reached showrooms, the decision about the Eldorado's future had effectively already been made, not in a single meeting, not with a single memo, but in the accumulated weight of sales data, capital allocation decisions, and a market that had quietly, completely moved on. The sales figures, the cooling system controversies, and the rise of the Escalade had formed a current too strong to redirect. By 2002, there was only one thing left for Cadillac to do: say goodbye with whatever grace remained. The last Eldorado was already being built. For the 2002 model year, Cadillac offered a collector's edition package on both the standard Eldorado and the touring coupe. Unique exterior colors, distinct interior trim, commemorative badging, acknowledging that this was the end. It was a graceful gesture, the kind of thing a brand does when it wants to mark a closing chapter with some dignity, rather than simply letting the production schedule speak for itself. How many were built is, depending on which source you consult, genuinely unclear. Figures in circulation range from roughly 200 units to over 1,500, and the discrepancy appears to come down to how the count is defined. Whether it includes only cars built with the specific commemorative package designation, or all 2002 Eldorados produced in the final weeks of the run, changes the number significantly. The definitive answer sits in General Motors production records held by the National Automotive History Collection in Detroit. Those records have not been publicly confirmed in any source that has been independently verified, so the exact count of the final Eldorados remains, fittingly, a small mystery. What is not a mystery is what those cars represented to the people who sought them out. Low-mileage final-year examples, particularly the collector's edition units, moved almost immediately into careful ownership. Some were purchased as collector vehicles from the day they were delivered, the same instinct that had driven buyers to preserve the 1976 convertibles as instant artifacts. There is a pattern in that. When Americans sense that something is genuinely ending, they reach for it, not always to drive it, sometimes just to keep it. The surviving cars from the full generation carry their own quiet history in unexpected places. The 1996 and later Eldorados came with OnStar as a factory option, one of the first production vehicles anywhere to offer it. The hardware is still physically present in surviving examples. The system used analog cellular networks and GPS positioning that were genuinely advanced for their moment. But the analog cellular network OnStar depended on was decommissioned in 2008, and the units have not functioned since. The hardware sitting in those overhead consoles is now a physical record of a specific technological moment, preserved inside a car that was itself a record of a specific cultural one. The Northstar engine created its own kind of aftermarket legacy. Thread repair kits sized specifically for the Northstar's head bolt dimensions are still commercially available, still actively sold, more than 2 decades after the last one was built. The existence of a commercial toolkit designed for one specific failure mode in one specific engine is unusual. It reflects both how many of these engines are still out there and how much their owners value keeping them running. The repair ecosystem that developed around the Northstar, across the Eldorado, the Seville, the DeVille, and later models, is larger than the Eldorado's own production volume would have supported alone. The engine outlasted the car it was built for. Cadillac introduced the XLR in 2004, a 2-seat roadster built on the Corvette platform, and it was sometimes described as a spiritual successor to the Eldorado's personal luxury tradition. It shared essentially nothing with the Eldorado mechanically. Different platform, different body style, different intent entirely. Roughly 15,000 units were built across 6 model years before it too was discontinued in 2009. No Cadillac coupe with anything approaching the Eldorado's market position has been offered since. What ended at Hamtramck in 2002 was not just a nameplate, it was a format. The personal luxury coupe as an American cultural object, the 2-door car built to express something beyond transportation, has not returned from any domestic manufacturer in the decades since. The segment did not pause. It did not contract and stabilize. It ended. Return for a moment to that engine. A 4.6-liter dual overhead Cam V8, all aluminum, 32 valves, with twin timing chains. Close to $1 billion in development. Built by engineers who looked at what Lexus was doing and decided, with complete seriousness, that they could answer it, that they could build something quieter, more refined, more durable, more worthy of the name on the hood. They were right. The Northstar was all of those things. And yet the car it was built for is gone. The segment it was designed to lead is gone. The showrooms that once displayed it have long since filled with SUVs, crossovers, trucks, everything the market decided it wanted instead. The billion-dollar gamble did not fail because the engineering was wrong. It failed because the world it was engineered for had already moved on before the first car reached the first buyer. That is a particular kind of loss, not the loss of something flawed or compromised or cheaply made. The loss of something genuinely accomplished, rendered irrelevant by forces that had nothing to do with its quality. What makes it stranger is that the engine survived. The Northstar outlasted the Eldorado by nearly a decade, carrying on in the DeVille, the Seville, the STS, right through to 2011. Specialist shops still rebuild them. Thread repair kits sized precisely for its head bolt dimensions are still sold today. Decades after the last one came off the line, the cars are still out there, in garages and driveways and carefully maintained collections, driven by people who understand what they are, not relics, not curiosities. Machines built with a level of intention that the market never properly rewarded, preserved now by the people who recognize that. There is something worth holding on to in that. The Eldorado outlasted its era. The buyers who should have crowded the showrooms in 1995 and 1998 and 2001 went elsewhere, but the cars remained. And the people who kept them, who learned the cooling system's requirements and the head bolt sensitivities and the particular feel of a Northstar at highway speed, they kept something alive that the production schedule could not. If this kind of story stays with you, there is another one worth watching right now. The Toyota Land Cruiser 100 faced its own impossible choice in 1998, and what Toyota did next changed everything. Go watch it. You won't want to stop halfway through.